Moving into the old Carrington house was supposed to be the start of our new life. Hannah and I had been searching for the perfect home for months, and when we found this historic gem, it seemed like a dream come true. The house, built in the late 1800s, had been beautifully restored while retaining its original charm. The grand staircase, ornate moldings, and expansive hallways captured our hearts immediately. Our first night in the house was peaceful. We laughed as we unpacked, drank wine, and marveled at our good fortune. But that tranquility was short-lived. The next night, at exactly 3 a.m., we heard footsteps in the hallway. "Hannah, did you hear that?" I whispered, my heart pounding. She nodded, eyes wide with fear. The sound was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through the silent house. We both got out of bed and crept to the door, peeking into the hallway. It was empty. The footsteps ceased as suddenly as they had begun. "Must be the old floor settling," I suggested, trying to calm both her and myself. But the explanation felt hollow. The footsteps continued every night at the same time. Each time they stopped the moment we ventured into the hallway. We started sleeping with the door closed, hoping that would somehow keep the sound at bay, but it only seemed to grow louder, more insistent. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, I began researching the history of the house. What I discovered was chilling. The Carrington house had once been a boarding school, operating from the late 1800s until the early 1900s. It had been closed abruptly after a student, Margaret Prescott, went missing under suspicious circumstances. She had vanished without a trace, and despite a thorough investigation, her disappearance remained unsolved. One evening, as Hannah and I sat in the library, I shared my findings with her. "A boarding school," she said, her face pale. "And a missing girl? That's terrifying." "I know," I replied, "but I think there's more to it. I found an old diary in the attic. It belonged to one of the students, a girl named Emily. She wrote about Margaret and how she was scared of someone in the school, a teacher named Mr. Thornhill." "Do you think he had something to do with her disappearance?" Hannah asked, her voice trembling. "It's possible. According to Emily's diary, Mr. Thornhill was strict and had a cruel streak. She mentioned hearing strange noises at night, too." We decided to investigate further, searching the house for any clues that might explain the nightly footsteps. We combed through the attic, the basement, and even the crawl spaces, but found nothing unusual. However, the footsteps persisted, growing louder and more oppressive with each passing night. One night, we decided to stay awake and confront whatever was causing the disturbance. Armed with flashlights and a sense of determination, we waited in the hallway at 2:55 a.m. As the clock struck 3, the footsteps began, echoing down the hallway toward us. "Hannah, look," I whispered, pointing to a faint, ghostly figure at the far end of the hall. The figure was that of a young girl, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She walked slowly, her footsteps heavy and deliberate. As she drew closer, I realized she was heading toward a specific spot on the floor. "She's trying to tell us something," Hannah said, her voice barely audible. We watched in awe as the girl stopped at a loose floorboard and pointed downwards. Then, she vanished, leaving us in stunned silence. I pried up the floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, we found a small, dusty box. Opening it, we discovered a collection of letters, photographs, and a locket. The letters detailed a secret relationship between Margaret and Mr. Thornhill. The photographs showed the two together, and the locket contained a lock of Margaret's hair. "This is it," I said. "This is what happened to her." We took the evidence to the local historical society, who helped us piece together the rest of the story. Mr. Thornhill had indeed been involved with Margaret, but when she tried to end the relationship, he became violent. The letters suggested that he had killed her in a fit of rage and hidden her body somewhere on the property. With this new information, the police were able to obtain a warrant to search the grounds. They eventually found Margaret's remains buried beneath the garden, bringing closure to a century-old mystery. After Margaret's body was exhumed and given a proper burial, the nightly footsteps ceased. The house felt lighter, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as if a weight had been removed. Hannah and I could finally sleep peacefully, knowing that we had helped Margaret find peace. Our lives slowly returned to normal, but the experience left a lasting impression. We had come face to face with the past, unraveling a dark secret that had haunted the house for generations. The Carrington house was no longer just our dream home. It was a place of history, tragedy, and ultimately, redemption. Every now and then, I think I catch a glimpse of a young girl in the hallway, her face serene, and her eyes filled with gratitude. I like to believe that Margaret is finally at rest, her story told, and her spirit free. And as for Hannah and me, we've grown stronger through the ordeal, our bond deepened by the shared experience of confronting the unknown. The Carrington house still stands, a testament to its storied past, and while it may hold other secrets, I am content knowing that we played a part in uncovering the truth and bringing peace to a troubled soul. Driving down Route 66 at night can be a lonely, almost surreal experience. The endless stretch of asphalt under the moonlit sky seemed to lead me into a void, with only the distant stars as my companions. I had been on the road for hours, the monotony, broken only by the occasional passing car. The road was desolate, surrounded by vast, empty plains that seemed to stretch on forever. I was heading to Flagstaff for a business meeting, trying to make good time when I saw the taillights of a car ahead of me. It was a vintage sedan, probably from the 1960s, moving at a steady pace. Relieved to see another vehicle on this desolate highway, I sped up to catch up to it, hoping to ease the loneliness of the drive. As I drew closer, the car's taillights flickered, and then, without warning, the entire vehicle vanished into thin air. One moment it was there, solid and real, and the next it was gone, leaving nothing but an empty stretch of road before me. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. I pulled over to the side, my mind racing to comprehend what I had just witnessed. Had I imagined it? Was I so tired that I was hallucinating? I stepped out of my car and stood on the shoulder of the road, looking around in bewilderment. The night was eerily silent. The only sound, the soft whisper of the wind through the dry grass. Determined to make sense of what had happened, I decided to investigate. I had noticed a small roadside diner a few miles back, the only sign of civilization for miles. I got back into my car and drove there, hoping someone might have seen the car or could offer an explanation. The diner was a relic from another era, with neon signs that flickered weakly and a parking lot filled with only a few cars. I parked and walked inside, greeted by the warm glow of dim lights and the smell of coffee and fried food. A handful of patrons sat at the counter, and a tired-looking waitress was pouring coffee into a cup. I approached the counter and took a seat. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a weary smile, came over to take my order. "Just coffee, please," I said, still shaken by what I had seen. As she poured my coffee, I decided to ask her about the disappearing car. "Ma'am, have you ever heard of anything strange happening on this stretch of highway?" She paused, her expression turning somber. "What kind of strange are you talking about, hon?" "I saw a car," I began, choosing my words carefully. "It was driving ahead of me, and then it just disappeared, vanished into thin air." The diner's patrons turned to look at me, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity and concern. The waitress set the coffee pot down and leaned in closer. "Are you sure about that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, taking a sip of my coffee. It was an old sedan, looked like it was from the 1960s. Red, with a distinctive tail fin design. It was there one moment and gone the next. She sighed, glancing around the diner before speaking again. "You're not the first person to see that car. Folks around here call it the Phantom Car. It belonged to the Johnson family. They went missing on this road about 30 years ago." Chills ran down my spine. "What happened to them?" "No one knows for sure," she said. "The Johnsons were a family of 4, John, Mary, and their 2 kids, Lily and Timmy. They were on their way to visit relatives, but never made it. Their car was never found, and neither were they. Some say they drove into another dimension. Others think it's the ghost of their car still trying to reach its destination." I felt a sense of dread settle over me. Has anyone ever tried to find out what really happened to them? "A few have tried," she replied, "but no one's ever come back with answers. It's like the road swallows them up." I thanked her for the coffee and the information, leaving a generous tip before heading back to my car. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know more, that I had to find out what happened to the Johnson family. I drove back to the spot where the car had disappeared, parking on the shoulder and stepping out into the cool night air. The road was silent, the darkness pressing in around me. I walked along the edge of the highway, searching for any clues, when I noticed something glinting in the moonlight. I crouched down and picked it up. It was a small, rusted locket, the kind a child might wear. Inside was a faded photograph of a little girl and boy, their faces smiling up at me. I knew immediately that these were the Johnson children, Lily and Timmy. As I held the locket, a sense of determination washed over me. I had to find out what happened to them. I got back into my car and drove further down the highway, my eyes scanning the road for any sign of the Phantom Car. The hours passed, and the road seemed endless. Just as I was about to give up and turn back, I saw it again. The red sedan, its taillights glowing in the distance. This time, I didn't hesitate. I sped up, determined to follow it to wherever it led. The car maintained a steady pace, and I kept my distance, afraid that if I got too close, it would vanish again. We drove for what felt like hours, the landscape growing increasingly desolate and strange. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over everything. Suddenly, the car veered off the road and into the desert. I followed, my headlights cutting through the darkness. We drove over rough terrain, the car ahead gliding smoothly, while mine jolted and bounced over the uneven ground. Eventually, we reached a clearing where the car came to a stop. I parked a short distance away and got out, my heart pounding in my chest. The red sedan was there, its engine silent, the air around it heavy with an unnatural stillness. I approached cautiously, my flashlight illuminating the car's interior. It was empty, but I could feel a presence, as if the Johnson family was still there, watching me. I circled the car, looking for any clues, when I noticed something strange. The ground around the car was littered with objects, personal belongings, photographs, toys, all weathered by time. As I picked up an old teddy bear, a wave of sorrow washed over me. These were the remnants of the Johnson family's life, left behind in this desolate place. I knew then that they had been trapped here, their spirits unable to move on. Determined to help them find peace, I gathered the belongings and placed them in the car. As I did, I felt a strange energy in the air, as if the very fabric of reality was shifting. The car began to glow with an ethereal light, and I stepped back, shielding my eyes. When the light faded, the car was gone, along with all the belongings. The clearing was empty, the night silent once more. I stood there, feeling a profound sense of loss and relief. The Johnson family was finally at peace, their spirits freed from this earthly plane. I drove back to the diner, feeling a strange sense of closure. The waitress and the patrons looked at me with curiosity as I walked in, and I told them what had happened. They listened in awe, their faces reflecting a mix of disbelief and wonder. The next morning, I continued my journey to Flagstaff, the events of the previous night still fresh in my mind. As I drove, I felt a sense of peace, knowing that I had helped bring closure to a tragic mystery. The road ahead seemed less daunting, the miles passing by in a blur. Years later, I still think about the Johnson family and the phantom car. I often wonder if there are other lost souls out there, trapped between worlds, waiting for someone to help them find their way home. And whenever I drive down a lonely stretch of highway, I keep my eyes peeled, hoping that I might once again be called upon to help those in need. The memory of that night remains vivid, a reminder that the past is never truly gone, and that sometimes the road to the unknown is closer than we think. In the crumbling outskirts of an old Victorian town, there stood an antique shop that had long been closed to the public, its windows coated in layers of dust and grime. Despite its uninviting exterior, the shop was a known legend among the locals, particularly because of one peculiar item: a large, ornate mirror with a frame carved from dark, twisted wood, known as the Mirror of Lost Souls. Rumors had it that the mirror did not reflect the present, but showed the faces of people who had mysteriously disappeared from the town over the decades. No one dared to claim ownership, for fear that acknowledging the mirror would draw the lost souls to them. On a dare, a group of teenagers, Alice, Mark, and Jenna, broke into the shop one stormy night. Armed with nothing but flashlights, they tiptoed through the clutter of forgotten relics until they came upon the fabled mirror. It stood, draped in a moth-eaten cloth, an eerie chill surrounding it. "Let's see if it's true," Mark said, his voice a mix of excitement and fear as he pulled the cloth away. The mirror's surface was surprisingly clean, reflecting their anxious faces. They stared, waiting, but nothing happened. "It's just a stupid old mirror," Jenna laughed nervously, her breath fogging up the glass. But as her laughter faded, the glass cleared, and an image slowly emerged. It wasn't Jenna's reflection anymore. Instead, it was a woman they'd never seen, her face twisted in a silent scream. Then another face appeared, and another, each one contorted in horror. The teens backed away, but Alice stood transfixed. The faces were familiar to her. They were people from her childhood stories, those who had vanished without a trace. She reached out, touching the cold glass, her fingertips brushing against a face that suddenly morphed into her own reflection. Alice's heart raced as she turned to tell the others, but Mark and Jenna were no longer there. In their place were their reflections in the mirror, their faces now among the lost, screaming for help. Panicked, Alice tried to run, but found herself facing the mirror again, no matter which way she turned. Desperate, She faced her own reflection once more, and watched in horror as it changed. Her face faded into that of an old, wrinkled woman, the original owner of the mirror, known to be a witch who'd cursed the townspeople who had shunned her. The witch's voice, like a whisper from the past, filled the room. "Free them and bind yourself," it hissed. Understanding her fate, Alice made a choice. She whispered a promise to remember them, to tell their stories, to ensure they were not forgotten. As she spoke, the screaming faces faded into smiles, one by one disappearing from the mirror. And with the last face gone, Alice found herself alone in the shop, the mirror now reflecting nothing but the empty room. She walked out as the first hints of dawn crept across the sky, leaving the mirror behind, its curse finally broken. But back in the mirror, in the deepest, darkest corner, a new face appeared. Alice's own, smiling sadly, forever bound to watch over those who might one day peer into the mirror of lost souls, seeking the truth of the lost.